which you, my God, have created.
Considered it all shameful. When they did go out as Beguines to minister, they went out 2 by 2 to protect their reputation. Because, as I've told my students over and over again with a smile on my face, women are the source of all sexual sin, and men are not responsible for any of their misbehavior. And so to protect their reputation, because they did go out fairly freely, they would go out 2 by 2, which is what we Benedictines did for years, including right here in Australia and up in the United States. Never went out alone, went out with at least 2, at least with one other sister to protect our reputation. And they did go out for a couple of reasons, not just conducting business. They went out to preach. This was a time of interdict. The French king had his army, and the Pope had the sacraments. And so when the French king misbehaved, or the Holy Roman Emperor, the Pope might lay down the law, and interdict meant he was no mass, no burial of the dead in consecrated ground, no access to any sacraments. And even Hildegard of Bingen endured this, if you remember her story, for burying someone in her cemetery that the church decided should not have been buried there. They were not allowed to chant the office. They had to recite it softly. So that's interdict. And there would be literally years when there was no celebration of Mass and no burial of people in consecrated ground. And so when there was no Mass, the Beguines filled in the gap by going out to the street corners and meeting in those churches and doing their own preaching. They translated the scripture into their own local vernacular, probably not the whole Bible, but whatever it is they wanted to be able to teach from, and they would teach and preach where the priests were not allowed to do so. They would meet in the marketplace with these puppet shows. Now, puppets were not these cute little things. A friend of mine went to Czechoslovakia to study the art of the medieval puppet. Her puppets are about this big. I don't know what that would be in meters, but they're about 3 feet tall in American. We never did learn the centimeter thing. Learning disabled in that department. But these puppets were quite large, and they would put on puppet shows teaching Bible stories and entertaining people in the local marketplace. They did run hospitals and hospices. That term gets used interchangeably because they had some health care. I mean, it was true. Hildegard wrote a whole book on medicine, so they had some health care that they could extend. But it was also a hospice, a place to journey with people who were dying. But it was also a hospice was a place where the destitute poor could go. And they might not be there permanently, but usually they would be coming in pretty sick, starvation-related diseases, live in the hospice for a while, regain their health, and then the Beguines would figure out, the next step for their life. Are they going to stay in one of our homes? Are they able to go back to their family? Whatever it is. So the terms are kind of fluid at this time. But women being in hospital ministry really actually does date back to the Beguines, who set these up. And they had a very good reputation for the cleanliness and the care that they extended to people. And it was always without a fee. And so in Beguinages, there was the magistra. A magistra is the title for a leader. Now, that's the feminine. A magister is the guy who has completed his master's degree in theology, and you get this kind of funky-looking hat, and then you bore the title magister. Quickly, even though they couldn't go to university and didn't have any kind of degree, the leaders of Beguinages were referred to as magistra. And they might only serve 2 or 3 years. Each community decided how long you were elected for, and then if you could be reelected, and all that sort of thing. But the magistra had a lot of the one who was in charge of the hospital or hospice actually also managed all the donations that were brought in and administered the finances for the Beguine community. So she was not only caring for the sick and the destitute, but she was running also the finances for the community. because they never went out begging. That was one of the reasons why they developed a good reputation. But people would just automatically make donations to them for their hospital or hospice. And so she had to administer that, which means she had people out overseeing the farms and the business, whatever she invested in to attend to those funds. Marie Duan becomes quickly the patron of Beguines, but she never claimed that title for herself. She actually lived at a time when the word was just beginning to emerge. But Marie Duan and her husband, again, one of these arranged marriages, decided quickly that they both wanted to serve the gospel and not live a traditional married life. And they moved out into the countryside to where some lepers were known to be dwelling. And they built a hut for each of the lepers in that area, plus one for each of them. They lived separately, and a chapel. And they actually literally formed a community living alongside the lepers, giving them a great sense of dignity and belonging. And the number of people who joined them really did increase, partly because of Marie's fame for her teaching and her quality of life, but also being impressed with the fact that they were willing to take on the context of a leper, which meant they too could not actually return to the city. You may know they had to, when they walked, they had a walking stick with a bell on it to make sure anyone knew that they were coming and that they were been classified as a leper. So they really were, ostracized from all of society. But she was much loved for that. And there's record of St. Francis of Assisi wanting to travel north to meet Marie Duan, but his health by then was getting pretty bad. Both Marie and Francis died of anorexia-related diseases. There is a book out called Holy Anorexia that you might be aware of, but a scholar traced all these stories from the desert on of people who, even though the church kept saying stop doing it, literally starved themselves to death in the belief that by only consuming the consecrated host, they could draw closer to God. Well, they sure did by passing to the other side. So don't follow that example, but Marie did end up dying of anorexia-related illness. She was really quite young, 33, 34. And that number may have some kind of meaning for people like that. We have surviving letters. Some of them were great letter writers. Hadwick and Mechtilde Magdeburg and Catherine of Siena. People don't realize Catherine is actually a Beguine. In her neighborhood in the city of Siena, they were called mantelates, and it was a reference to a black woolen wrap they would wear around their shoulders when they go out. And it's only about 200 years later when the Dominicans and the Franciscans are fighting over prominence in the church that all of a sudden they go back in history and they start claiming some of these women as they would call them Dominican tertiaries or Franciscan tertiary. That's a word they made up later on and went back in history to claim these women as their own as proof of why the Dominican way is better or why the Franciscan way is better. What is true is that someone like Angela of Foligno, Penitentia, or of Catherine of Siena, is that they tended to favor, in Catherine's case, the Dominican church in town and therefore the Dominican preachers. But women were not welcome into the Dominican order. They just literally were not until probably the mid-1300s. Or Angela Foligno, she was an early follower of Francis and his followers, but not joining because they weren't welcome. They just were not welcome. But they claimed Francis's charism or Dominic's charism. And so later on they get wrapped up into that movement. But Angela Foligno, actually Clare of Assisi, wanted to go out and follow Francis and his guys and preach the gospel to the four corners of the earth. But unfortunately, she was from a very powerful family who was scandalized by that idea, and they threw her behind a grill with some of her companions. And that's the genesis of the Poor Clare movement, but it was not what she wanted. She was a penitentia, and she did try for several years to live that life until she lost the family fight and ended up behind that grill and made the best of her desert. I imagine behind that grill that was her desert, both because she didn't want to be there, but because they tried to embrace lady poverty, which was not hard to do behind that grill, because they couldn't get out and they did not have control of their own money anymore.